Bullies pushed her down the stairs, but didn't know she was trained by the military, so they shoved her down the stairs but had no idea she was trained by the military. Lin Chen had always been different, though most people at Westfield Academy couldn't quite figure out why. At 17, she was petite with a compact frame that made her school uniform hang loosely on her small shoulders. Her straight black hair was always braided down her back, and she rotated between the same 3 worn cardigans. But it wasn't just her appearance that set her apart, it was her quietness. While other students filled the corridors with gossip and laughter, Lin moved through Westfield Academy like a shadow. She kept her gaze down, spoke only when addressed, and had mastered the art of becoming unnoticeable. Most assumed she was just another reserved Asian student trying to avoid attention. They had no clue that her silence stemmed from years of military discipline instilled by her father, Master Sergeant David Chen, before his overseas assignment. Stay low, watch everything, and never show your hand unless absolutely necessary. Her father's words echoed in her mind each morning as she entered the academy's main doors. The irony wasn't lost on her. She could likely overpower half the wrestling team without breaking a sweat, yet she spent her days ducking conflict at every turn. Westfield Academy was typical of most private schools: marble hallways lined with trophy cases, a dining hall that perpetually smelled of institutional food, and students who had established their social pecking order years earlier. Lin had transferred here 8 months ago when her mother secured a position at the nearby medical center, and she still felt like an observer peering through glass. The trouble began gradually, as these situations often do. It started with Ethan Crawford, a senior who stood 6'2" and carried himself with the arrogant confidence that came from being captain of the lacrosse team. His blonde hair was always perfectly styled, and his varsity jacket seemed surgically attached to his broad shoulders. Beside him stood his loyal followers: Marcus Wade, a defensive end whose arms were thicker than most people's legs, and Brittany Foster, whose designer nails were as sharp as her cutting remarks. "Watch it, Chen," Ethan had snapped the first time Lin accidentally brushed against him in the corridor. She had muttered an apology and hurried away, missing the predatory gleam in his eyes that suggested he had identified his next victim. The harassment intensified slowly. First came the deliberate shoulder bumps that sent Lin's textbooks tumbling to the floor. Then came the whispered comments about her clothes, her accent, her mother's job at the medical center. Brittany took special delight in making loud observations about Lin's appearance whenever she passed their table in the dining hall. "Doesn't she own anything that actually fits?" Brittany would announce, not bothering to whisper. "I mean, shopping at discount stores is one thing, but this is just pathetic." Lin endured it all silently, her jaw tight but her face expressionless. Don't react, don't escalate, blend in and survive. The principles her father had drilled into her kept her centered even as her hands itched to wipe that smirk off Brittany's face. The worst part wasn't the bullying itself. It was how everyone else simply watched. Teachers looked away when Ethan's group cornered her by her locker. Other students pretended not to hear Brittany's cruel observations. Even those who seemed sympathetic never intervened, terrified of becoming targets themselves. This is what cowardice looks like, Lin thought, as she watched another classmate turn away when Ethan knocked her water bottle from her hands in the hallway. The water splashed across her homework, and she had to clench her teeth to prevent herself from saying something that would escalate the situation. Mrs. Henderson, her history teacher, was the only adult who seemed to recognize something was amiss. She had asked Lin to stay after class one afternoon, her silver hair neatly arranged and worry etched across her lined face. "Lin, is everything okay? You seem more withdrawn than usual." Lin had forced a smile and shrugged. "I'm fine, Mrs. Henderson, just concentrating on my studies." But she wasn't fine. Each day brought fresh humiliations, and every evening she returned home with her father's voice in her head, reminding her to stay disciplined, stay focused, and never let emotions dictate her actions. The problem was, her emotions were becoming increasingly difficult to suppress. The tipping point arrived on a Thursday in April. Lynn was climbing the main staircase between periods, her backpack loaded with textbooks, when she felt a violent push from behind. The world spun, and she found herself tumbling down 15 marble steps, her books exploding around her like debris. She struck the landing hard, her shoulder absorbing most of the impact before her head bounced off the wall. Stars burst behind her eyelids, and for a moment she couldn't determine up from down. When her vision cleared, she saw Ethan standing at the top of the stairs with Marcus and Brittany, all three laughing. "Oops," Ethan called down, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "You really should be more careful, Chen. These stairs can be treacherous." A crowd had formed, phones already recording. Lynn could hear the whispers, the muffled giggles, the complete absence of concern for her well-being. Blood trickled from a gash on her temple, and her shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat. "Get up," she commanded herself. "Get up and walk away. Don't give them the satisfaction." But as she struggled to her feet, collecting her scattered belongings while the crowd dispersed as if she were merely temporary entertainment, something inside her fractured. Not her discipline. That remained solid. Not her control. She was still acutely aware of every muscle, every breath, every heartbeat. What shattered was her willingness to remain invisible. That evening, Lynn stared at herself in her bedroom mirror, cataloguing the damage. The cut on her temple would heal, and the bruises on her shoulder were already darkening to purple. But something else had transformed. Her eyes looked different, harder, more focused. She opened her dresser and pushed aside the cardigans and oversized shirts until she found what she sought, a small lacquered box her father had given her before his deployment. Inside were his dog tags, several photographs, and a letter he had written, but instructed her not to open unless she truly needed it. Tonight, she needed it. "Lynn," the letter began in her father's precise handwriting, "if you're reading this, it means you've reached a crossroads where you need to remember who you are. You are not just my daughter, you are a Chen. We do not bow to bullies, we do not accept defeat, and we never, ever allow anyone to push us around without consequences. But remember this above all, strength without discipline is brutality. Power without compassion is tyranny. Be strong, but be just. Be fierce, but be fair. Show them who you are, but don't become someone you'll regret being." Lynn folded the letter carefully and returned it to the box. Then she went to her closet and retrieved clothes she hadn't worn since transferring. Dark jeans that actually fit, a fitted navy sweater, and combat boots her father had bought her for her 16th birthday. The next morning, Lin Chen walked into Westfield Academy as a different person. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Her posture was straighter, her stride more confident. She had pulled her hair back in a tight bun instead of her usual braid, and the fitted clothes revealed a physique that had been concealed for months beneath loose fabric. Students who had barely noticed her before found their eyes following her down the corridor. Ethan noticed too. He was standing by his locker with Marcus when Lynn walked past, and she caught the way his eyes narrowed as he registered her transformation. "Well, well," he called after her. "Look who decided to dress up. Special occasion, Chen?" Lynn stopped walking. For the first time in 8 months, she turned around and looked Ethan Crawford directly in the eyes. The hallway seemed to hush around them, as if everyone sensed that something fundamental had shifted. "Every day is special when you're not intimidated by pathetic bullies," she said, her voice carrying clearly down the corridor. The words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. Ethan's face flushed crimson, and Marcus stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. "What did you just say?" Ethan demanded, his voice rising. Lynn smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "I said what I said. Maybe you should work on your listening skills instead of your aim." The crowd that had gathered gasped. Someone whispered, "Did she really just—" But Lynn was already walking away, leaving Ethan and his crew staring after her in shock. The remainder of the morning passed in strange tension. Word had spread quickly about Lynn's confrontation with Ethan, and she could feel eyes on her wherever she went. Some students looked at her with newfound respect, others with concern, and a few with the eager anticipation of spectators who sensed violence brewing. Brittany cornered her in the restroom during lunch, her perfect makeup unable to mask the venom in her eyes. "You think you're tough now?" she hissed, blocking Lynn's path to the door. "You think changing your clothes makes you special? You're still the same pathetic little immigrant girl who doesn't belong here." Lynn studied Brittany for a moment, taking in her stance, her body language, the nervous energy that suggested fear masquerading as anger. "You're right," Lynn said quietly. "I am the same person. The only difference is I'm done pretending to be weak to make you feel strong." Before Brittany could respond, Lynn stepped around her and walked out, leaving the mean girl sputtering in confusion. The real confrontation came after school. Lynn was walking toward the bus pickup when she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Ethan's expensive cologne was distinctive, and Marcus's labored breathing was unmistakable. "Hey, Chen," Ethan's voice was tight with rage. "We need to have a conversation." Lynn stopped walking but didn't turn around. Around them, other students had noticed the brewing confrontation and were forming a loose circle, phones already out and ready. "Nothing to discuss, Crawford." "Oh, I think there is." Ethan's voice was getting closer. "See, you embarrassed me today. Made me look bad in front of everyone. That's not something I can overlook." Lynn finally turned around. Ethan was standing less than 3 feet away, with Marcus on his right and Brittany slightly behind them. Their faces were flushed with anger and humiliation, and she could see they had worked themselves up to this moment. "You embarrassed yourself," Lynn said calmly. "I just pointed it out. You little—" Ethan lunged forward, his hand reaching for Lynn's shoulder. He never made contact. Lynn's response was instinctive and devastating. Years of training with her father, countless hours learning to defend herself and others, muscle memory that had been dormant for months, all of it came flooding back in an instant. She sidestepped Ethan's clumsy grab, seized his extended wrist, and used his own momentum to send him stumbling past her. Before he could recover, she pivoted and drove her elbow into his solar plexus, doubling him over and leaving him gasping for air. Marcus, shocked by the speed of Lynn's response, threw a wild haymaker that would have connected with most opponents. But Lynn wasn't most opponents. She ducked under his punch, stepped inside his guard, and delivered a quick combination to his ribs that dropped him to one knee. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 10 seconds. Brittany screamed, but it was too late. Lynn had already stepped back, her hands at her sides, her breathing steady and controlled. She looked down at Ethan, who was still struggling to catch his breath. "Stay down," she said quietly. "Both of you." But Ethan Crawford had never backed down from anything in his life, and humiliation was a powerful motivator. With a roar of fury, he pushed himself to his feet and charged at Lynn with everything he had. This time, Lynn didn't hold back. She caught Ethan's wild swing, twisted his arm behind his back, and swept his legs out from under him in one fluid motion. He hit the pavement hard, and before he could move, Lynn had him in a perfect chokehold. Not enough to seriously injure him, but enough to make her point crystal clear. "I could have done this 8 months ago," she whispered in his ear, her voice deadly calm. "I could have put you in the hospital the first time you pushed me. Do you know why I didn't?" Ethan struggled against her grip, but Lynn's hold was unbreakable. "Because I'm not like you," she continued. "I don't hurt people for entertainment. I don't pick on people weaker than me, and I don't need to make others feel small to feel big about myself." She released him and stepped back. Ethan scrambled to his feet, his face red with embarrassment and rage, but something in Lynn's eyes stopped him from attacking again. "This is finished," Lynn announced, her voice carrying to every student in the circle. "You leave me alone, you leave everyone else alone, and we never have to do this again. But if you try to push me or anyone else around again, I promise you, this will look like a warm-up." The crowd was silent, phones still recording, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. Marcus was back on his feet, but keeping his distance, and Brittany looked like she wanted to disappear entirely. Ethan stared at Lynn for a long moment, and she could see the calculation in his eyes. He was weighing his options, trying to figure out how to save face, how to maintain his reputation as the tough guy who didn't back down from anyone. Finally, he nodded slowly. "This isn't over, Chen." "Yeah," Lynn said quietly. "It is." Ethan and his crew walked away, the crowd gradually dispersing as the excitement died down. Lynn picked up her backpack and continued toward the bus pickup, her heart still pounding, but her expression calm. Mrs. Henderson was waiting by the bus when Lynn arrived, her face creased with concern. "Lynn, are you all right? I heard there was some kind of altercation." Lynn managed a small smile. "I'm fine, Mrs. Henderson. Everything's fine now." The next few days at Westfield Academy were different in ways both subtle and profound. Ethan Crawford still walked the halls with his varsity jacket and his swagger, but there was something diminished about him. He no longer made eye contact with Lynn when they passed in the corridor, and his crew of followers seemed less eager to participate in his usual antics. More importantly, Lynn noticed other changes. Students who had never spoken to her before nodded respectfully when they saw her. Underclassmen who had been targets of Ethan's crew seemed to walk a little taller, and gradually other students began to find their voices too. It started small, someone telling Brittany to keep her nasty comments to herself, another student helping pick up books that had been knocked down. But it grew into something bigger, a shift in the school's culture that said bullying wouldn't be tolerated anymore. Lynn still kept to herself, but it was different now. Before, her solitude had been born of fear and the desire to remain invisible. Now it was a choice. She had proven she could handle herself, and more importantly, she had proven she wouldn't abuse that ability. 2 weeks after the confrontation, Ethan Crawford approached her at her locker. He looked different, smaller somehow, less sure of himself. "Chen," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. Can we talk?" Lynn studied his face, looking for signs of deception or anger. What she saw instead was something she hadn't expected. Genuine remorse. "What do you want, Crawford?" Ethan ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that made him look younger and more vulnerable. "I wanted to apologize for everything, for pushing you, for the stairs, for all of it." Lynn waited, saying nothing. "I know this sounds stupid," Ethan continued, "but I never really thought about what I was doing. I mean, I knew it was cruel, but I didn't think about how it actually affected you. Seeing you fight back, seeing how strong you actually are, it made me realize I was just being a coward." "You were," Lynn agreed, "but recognizing it is a start." Ethan nodded. "I know I can't undo what I did, but I want you to know it won't happen again. And if anyone else tries to mess with you, they'll have to go through me first." Lynn almost smiled at that. "I can take care of myself." "Yeah," Ethan said, touching his ribs where she had hit him. "I figured that out." They stood there for a moment in awkward silence before Ethan spoke again. "How did you learn to fight like that?" "My father," Lynn said simply. "He taught me that strength is only valuable if you use it to protect people, not harm them." Ethan nodded slowly. "Sounds like a wise man." "He is." After Ethan walked away, Lynn reflected on how much had changed in just a few weeks. She was still the same person, still quiet, still observant, still more comfortable in her own company than in a crowd. But she was no longer afraid, and more importantly, she was no longer willing to let others be afraid either. Her father called that night, his voice crackling through the long-distance connection from overseas. "I heard you had some excitement at school," he said, and Lynn could hear the pride in his voice. "How did you?" "Your mother told me. She said you handled yourself well." Lynn smiled. I remembered what you taught me. All of it. All of it? Especially the part about not becoming the thing you fight against? Good girl. That's the most important lesson of all. As Lynn hung up the phone, she thought about the letter her father had written, about strength and restraint, about being fierce but fair. She had learned those lessons well, but she had also learned something her father hadn't taught her. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't in defeating your enemies, but in helping them become better people. Westfield Academy was still the same school, with the same marble corridors and the same smell of institutional food in the dining hall. But the atmosphere was different now. Students walked with more confidence, knowing that bullies could be stopped. Teachers paid more attention, having seen what happened when they didn't. And Lin Chen, the quiet girl who had once tried so hard to be invisible, had become exactly what her father had always known she could be: a protector, a leader, and proof that true strength comes not from the ability to hurt others, but from the wisdom to know when that ability should be used.